Hi, everyone, and welcome to Radio Socialist Olympia, the podcast of the Olympia Democratic Socialists of America. I'm Corey.
And I'm Isaac.
Thank you for joining us for this, our second part of our multi-part episode on why we're socialists and not liberals. In this series, we're exploring the differences between the liberal and the socialist approaches to politics and why we believe that socialism is the only political tradition that can address the challenges of our time.
So a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First off, apologies for some audio issues in the previous segment. We were still getting a feel for recording and for the equipment we were using. We didn't hear that it was the table or a chair creaking while we were recording, but the mic was picking it up. I tried to clean that up in editing, but obviously it was not perfect.
Second, now that we're past the introduction and getting into the substance of our topic, if we haven't already, it's probably a good time to say that we're speaking here as ourselves, and that our viewpoints aren't necessarily those of DSA as a whole, or any other organizations we're a part of. Among socialists and the broader left, there are different viewpoints on some of these issues that we'll be tackling. Our perspective here is based on our own reading of theory and our own experience of political practice. Third, because our series on this topic will cover a lot of ground, we are condensing information from various sources. For folks who want to go deeper into any of these subtopics, we'll be providing a list of our sources for each segment to be included with the notes with each episode.
And finally, for a bit of fun, after recording the first segment, Corey suggested we have a swear jar where I have to put in a quarter every time I say the word indeed. The point is well taken. However, since we're Marxists, I think it would be funnier if we made the joke more topical and we have to put in a quarter each time one of us uses some really stereotypical piece of Marxist jargon, like saying objective or objectively, as in the objective conditions, or use vulgar or undialectical to denote analysis we disagree with, like saying vulgar materialism, etc. So let's see how much money we have in there by the time this series is done.
And so, in the first segment of this episode, we opened the topic by discussing how recent political developments have brought ideas like socialism and liberalism back into discussion in the U.S. for the first time in a long time. We've discussed how there are some outward similarities and some shared values, and also a lot of fundamental ideological and political differences between liberalism and socialism. In this episode, we'll be getting into what we really mean by these.
And this requires delving into some history going back a few hundred years to when the new economic system of capitalism was ascending to replace the old order of feudalism. Liberalism and socialism are both products of this period in history, reflecting the economic interests and experiences of different social classes that arose during this transformation.
All right, so Isaac and I both split this up into two parts, doing the history of liberalism as an ideology and then the history of socialism as an ideology. And I'm going to give you the history of liberalism going back to about the mid to early 18th century. Liberalism as an ideology has its roots in the works of John Locke and works like his first and second treatises of government. He's the guy who coined the phrase life, liberty, and property that was later modified in the Declaration of Independence as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The word comes from the Latin liber, or free, as in the ideology of free men and their cultivated pursuits. Political liberalism first came to prominence during the French Revolution, often described as the first bourgeois revolution, because the driving force behind it was educated professionals and men of commerce, who often chafed under the rule of monarchy and hereditary aristocrats. As a quick aside, the word bourgeois comes from the German Bürger, as just someone who lives in a town. For more on this period of history, I'd recommend listening to Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast, who devoted an entire 54-episode run to the French Revolution. It gets into just how dysfunctional the Ancien regime France was leading up to the revolution, especially its highly fragmented system of laws, courts, internal tariffs, aristocratic privileges, and ecclesiastical jurisdictions, deriving from France's formation as an agglomeration of feudal holdings under the monarchy. Hardly anyone lived under the same set of rules. It also explains how the revolution was really one of the middle class, and how the revolutionary government had to actually fight several peasant rebellions by people who felt left out or threatened by the new order. Liberals at this period wanted a constitutional monarchy. As a product of the Enlightenment, liberals valued human reason over divine revelation, hence a constitutional monarchy where the crown was granted by the people rather than by God. Freedom of worship, universal male suffrage, expropriation of church land. Up until the French Revolution, the church was by far the largest landowner. Secular government, and a rational, uniform set of laws and regulations. French liberals in particular were self-consciously centrist, placing themselves between ultra-royalist conservatives on the right and Jacobins on the left after the revolution started to turn to the left. Classical liberalism started to approach its modern form in England in the mid-1850s, where the political liberalism we saw in the French Revolution fused with laissez-faire free market economics. There's a really great book called Liberalism at Large, The World According to the Economist, that follows the history of liberalism through the pages of The Economist magazine. Full disclosure, much of the rest of this segment will be drawn from this book. The people who founded the magazine went into it with the intention of shifting government policy towards free markets and the abolition of tariffs, and this was from the beginning an elite-driven effort. To quote William Bagehot, and I'm going to try and do my awful English accent here, for he is the first editor of The Economist, "It is useless to pile up abstract words. Those who doubt should go into their kitchens. Let an accomplished man try what seems to him most obvious, most palpable in intellectual matters upon the housemaid and the footman, and he will find what he says seems unintelligible, that his audience thinks him mad and wild when he is speaking in what in his own sphere of thought, the dullest platitude of cautious soberness." Sorry about that, I had to. Interestingly, Karl Marx was a reader of The Economist during this period, and he noted in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, 1851, that there was a section of liberal opinion that was prepared to accept a dictatorship or authoritarian government in order to stave off populist reforms. Speaking of President, later Emperor, Louis Bonaparte, the president is a guardian of order and is recognized as such on every stock exchange of Europe. Let that sink in. This is something that'll come up in later episodes of the podcast, that when push comes to shove, many liberal elites would rather accept an illiberal government that restricts civil liberties if it would means order and security of property and investments. We see a little moderation of liberalism in the beginning of the 20th century during an electoral alliance between the Liberal Party of England and Labour, where the Liberals adopted reforms aimed at raising the material living standards of the working class. There were other reasons besides cynical electoral strategy, including influences from philosophers such as John Stuart Mill, who encouraged a more communitarian ethic, including worker cooperatives. But there was definitely the intent of preempting any left-wing revolution that might go after private property rights. And as a slight aside, the welfare state was actually pioneered by Germany under blood and iron arch-conservative Otto von Bismarck in the late 19th century for precisely this reason, even as his government enacted laws to suppress socialists. And to quote Francis Hurt, editor of The Economist, writing in 1909, I'm not going to do my English accent again, "It may be wrong to tax very rich men at a higher rate than men with only moderate incomes, but it is not socialism. It may be wrong to relieve landlords of income tax, but it is not socialism. It may be wrong to tax the still rather than the teapot, but it is not socialism. If this budget was socialism, the public may be sure that it would have been welcomed by the Morning Post and torn to pieces by The Economist." To pick up on a point that we made in our last episode, socialism is about more than just the government spending money. Numerous moderate or even conservative governments have adopted social welfare programs in order to diffuse the threat of revolution from the left, or because popular opinion and strong working class organizations made it politically unwise not to. So you're probably wondering, how do we get from the Liberal Party of England in the early 1900s to Americans calling themselves liberals today? Well, after the defeat of Teddy Roosevelt, the 1912 presidential election, the term progressive had lost its appeal for a lot of people. The New Republic magazine, which still exists today, was founded in 1914, chose the term liberal as an alternative label. And Woodrow Wilson, the guy who won the 1912 election, described his foreign policy as liberal. And later, when FDR became president in 1933, he chose liberal to describe his administration's policies as middle ground. Progressive, as strange as it may seem now, was associated with Republicans, while socialist and social democratic were too extreme in a country that had already had one Red Scare. This is how liberal came to be associated with Democrats, while many populist-minded people came to identify as liberals, even though liberalism as an ideology is generally anything but populist. So during the 20th century, liberalism became firmly tied to anti-communism. And while there was a brief flirtation with economic planning during World War II in both the UK and the US, that mostly ended as soon as the Cold War started. Liberal politicians, for the most part, supported the enforcement of a liberal international order and authorized the overthrow of left-wing governments all around the world. We'll do an episode later in this series on imperialism and the differences in internationalism and foreign policy between liberals and socialists. Later, when the neoliberal revolution hit in the 1970s with Carter in the US and Thatcher in the UK, we see a shift in economic policy towards deregulation, cutting top tax rates, and a sharp rise in income and wealth inequality across the political spectrum, and the rise of the so-called neoliberal consensus, also known as the Washington Consensus. So deep is this neoliberal consensus sunk that most people today are unable to imagine a world that does not involve a capitalist market economy. I'll just take a moment to say that neoliberalism is frequently misused by our fellow leftists as an epithet applied to anyone to the political right of them. We're using it in a very specific sense, which we would argue is the correct one. Neoliberalism is a form of liberalism which argues that things are better when run by market pressures and demands across-the-board privatization and austerity, and has mostly abandoned the social democratic or redistributive strain of liberalism that at least acknowledged positive freedoms. You think of FDR's For Freedom speech, which included a freedom from want. And I would encourage listeners to read a 2017 article from Vox called Neoliberalism Isn't an Empty Epithet. It's a real powerful set of ideas. So the neoliberalism is very much distinct from the idealistic strain of liberalism that you would have seen in the early Liberal Party.
Right, like neoliberalism is a specific form of political economy.
Yeah, agreed. And there's persuasive argument to be made that the modern liberal-conservative split is really just a split between the left and right wings of liberalism, rather than a battle between fundamentally distinct ideologies.
At the dawn of the liberal capitalist era, conservatives were people who were like, actually monarchy is good.
Yeah, the conservatives were the people who believed in like maintaining aristocratic privileges and hunting rights on noble lands and things like that. So this is essentially the thesis of Domenico Lasordo's book, Liberalism, A Counter-History. Liberalism is torn by the contradictions between its universalist aspirations of freedom and democracy and the economic imperatives of capitalism, which necessarily involve limiting the community of the free. Some factions lean one way, some the other, but without really going outside the frame of capitalist society and economics. This is also what some leftists, Green Party members, and others will talk about when they say that there is, quote, no difference between the Democratic and Republican parties. To be clear, we both agree that there are important differences between the two parties on social issues, public health, vaccinations, etc., but we also agree that there is a large amount of overlap between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to government policy towards corporations, and that both parties seem to prioritize, or at least not substantially challenge, policies that benefit corporations and owners of wealth. I'll just point out that the bank bailouts were actually supported by a great many Democrats, with little, if any, punishment of the banks responsible for the crisis, and that if you look at the vote breakdown, there were just about equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans on both sides of the vote. So it wasn't like a strict party line thing. And obviously, there's a lot more that I could go into on this, but I'm not a historian, and our listeners probably aren't here for a 2-hour episode. Much as I love Dan Carlin, we're not Dan Carlin, so I'll just hand it over to Isaac. Isaac?
Right, so now I'll talk a little bit about the history of socialism as an ideology. And just as Corey described liberalism as the ideology of the bourgeois class fighting against the constraints imposed by hereditary aristocracy and its privileges, socialism was also an ideological response to the new social contradictions and very real human miseries that were unleashed by capitalist development. There are plenty of examples of historical figures and movements that can be described as socialist to one extent or another, going back several hundred years. During the English Civil War, there were the Diggers, who were proto-communist religious radicals who lived on communes and believed that property was theft. It's been argued that Jesus was a socialist, and there were definitely some strong communal tendencies among early Christian communities. But socialism, as we understand it today, derives from the work of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, most famous for the Communist Manifesto of 1848.
Oh, and by the way, on the subject of the Diggers, there is another podcast plug. That would be episode 1.12b of the English Revolution series for Revolutions podcast. And also, there is a t-shirt, a very excellent t-shirt that says, God told me to tell you that property is theft.
I gotta get one of those. So there were definitely socialists before Marx and Engels, such as Charles Fourier, whose voluntary communes he and his followers hoped would inspire others to imitate them. The utopian communities of the Owenites, such as the community of New Harmony, Indiana, and the Fabians, who believed in the gradual evolution of society into socialism, furthered by the enlightened self-interest of wealthy and educated people. Oscar Wilde is actually perhaps the most famous Fabian socialist. But Marx and Engels were the first to apply philosophical materialism to the study of society and how to change it, to elaborate a theory of class struggle as the motive force in history, and to insist that the proletariat or working class, the wage earners who came about under capitalism, must emancipate themselves rather than waiting for change granted from above. So Marxism as a system of thought is built on a combination of French utopian socialism, classical German philosophy, particularly combining Hegel's dialectic with a materialist outlook, and of course, classic British political economy. These are often referred to together as the Three Pillars of Marxism, which Lenin described in his 1913 essay, The Three Sources and the Three Component Parts of Marxism. If you'd rather not read Lenin, there's another episode of the Revolutions podcast, 10.3 from the Russian Revolution series, which I've listened to it. It does a pretty good job of summarizing those three parts of Marxism.
And just no, we're not getting sponsored by Mike Duncan to promote his podcast, so maybe with the number of times we've plugged him so far, maybe we should send him an email.
Right. So much as liberalism can be described as a reaction by the bourgeoisie against the strictures of feudalism, Marxism can be described as a response to the miseries created by the Industrial Revolution. Friedrich Engels' worldview was shaped in part by firsthand experience of the exploitation of English factory workers while he was overseeing his family's business in Manchester. Like, his dad was a factory owner, and that's where he first got a taste of what capitalism could really do to cause misery. Both liberalism and socialism were products of their social and historical contexts. In 1848, revolution spread over all of Europe, from France to Austria-Hungary to Germany and to Italy. A combination of famine, recession, nationalism, idealism, and dissatisfaction with stagnating monarchies created conditions ripe for revolution. However, despite these oppressive conditions, these revolutions were still primarily liberal in character, not working class. 1848 was actually something of a setback for European socialists as governments scrambled to repress their respective left-wing movements. It was this repression, in fact, that caused so many German socialists to emigrate to the United States, and they were often part of the founding of the socialist movement here, and partly why, for example, the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, was electing socialist mayors as late as the 1940s. They had a lot of German immigrants with a socialist background.
Sometimes referred to as the Milwaukee School of Socialism, or Good Governments and Roads School of Socialism, that wins public acceptance by just providing basic public services.
They were called the sewer socialists because they did a lot of infrastructure.
Oh, and on that note, if you want to learn more about the 1848 revolutions, that's episodes 8.1 to 8.3 of Revolutions.
Over the second half of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, many countries across Europe developed socialist or labor parties, such as the SPD in Germany, founded in 1863, and the SAP in Sweden, founded in 1889, both of which still exist, albeit their politics are much watered down. They're more reformist and technocratic. Both parties, though, participated in elections, ran candidates, and also operated social clubs, summer camps, published newspapers, and supported really an entire socialist proletarian way of life. These parties were powerful enough that they forced many European states to adopt reforms and create welfare programs in order to diffuse the threat they posed in both elections and of labor unrest and actual revolution. The 20th century overall was a rough period for socialism. World War I forced many of these socialist and social democratic parties to choose between nationalism on the one hand and international working class solidarity on the other. Sadly, most of these parties, including the German SPD, chose to support their respective states in the war effort under the logic that to not do so would bring ruin at home. This cost them a significant portion of their support from the left. The German Communist Party split off from the SPD as a part of this. Other parties, like the Russian Bolsheviks, fiercely opposed the war in the name of proletarian unity and denounced their former comrades, such as the German SPD, as opportunists. The unexpected success of the Russian Revolution in 1917 introduced the possibility of abandoning gradual reform and electoral participation for overthrowing the capitalist state entirely. It also caused a widespread split among existing socialist parties like the Socialist Party of Eugene V. Debs in the U.S., and newer parties like the American Communist Party, who absorbed many of the former's members. Notably, Debs, probably America's most famous socialist before Bernie Sanders, was imprisoned on sedition charges for vocally opposing World War I and eventually ran for president from jail. The rise of fascism in Europe in the 1920s and 30s was another major setback for socialism, and in fact was in many ways a response to attempted revolutions. We'll get into this in more detail in a later episode we have planned, but in short, the very same countries where fascism came to power in Europe, Germany, Italy, and Spain, also had strong left-wing movements, and it was not a foregone conclusion that these countries would fall to fascism. Italian anarchists and communists were leading strikes of factory workers, and Germany nearly had a communist revolution after the government surrendered in World War I and the Kaiser fled the country. In each case, the political center and center-right chose to ally with the far-right, seeing them as useful allies against the left. Some Italian liberals, for example, were openly supportive of Mussolini's fascists for having defeated the communist threat to private property. The left parties in these countries also made their own strategic blunders that contributed to their collapse in strength throughout the 20s and 30s, but we'll save that for later as well. The rise of the Soviet Union as a powerful state following the Russian Revolution may have seemed like a good thing for socialist movements around the world, but in practice it was a mixed blessing. While on the one hand there was a powerful state willing to provide support and training, and in some cases weapons, to socialist movements, on the other hand, that assistance came with a lot of strings. Under Stalin and afterward, Moscow often strictly dictated the policies of other communist parties with little regard for local conditions, and generally prioritized the short-term interests of the Soviet Union over the long-term success of the revolutionary movement. This often had very bad consequences for communist parties like the one in the United States. One reason that the German Communist Party didn't join forces with the SPD against the Nazis is because they had been instructed not to by Stalin.
Yeah, this is another episode of, but not from Revolutions, it's a Behind the Bastards podcast, the non-Nazi bastards who helped Hitler rise to power. And listen to that.
Once the Cold War got started in the wake of World War II, any left-wing government faced the choice between accepting Soviet or later possibly Chinese aid, being overthrown by a Western intelligence agency like the CIA, or trying to go it alone. The American Communist Party was a significant force in American politics in the 1930s, but many of its members felt betrayed by the Soviet Union for signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Nazis in 1939 and later in 1956, when Nikita Khrushchev revealed the extent of Stalin's crimes. If you're interested in the history of the American Communist Party, definitely recommend reading Vivian Gornick's The Romance of American Communism, in which she interviews a bunch of former members of the American Communist Party, and you really see both the really inspiring and the really dark sides of that experience. In our last episode, we mentioned that there are some leftists who still will argue that Stalin and Mao did nothing wrong, or that what they did was necessary to realize socialism in the respective countries, or that their crimes are blown far out of proportion by Western propagandists. Obviously, anti-communists had full motivation to exaggerate some of that stuff, but we would argue that it is very real also, that it is important not to understate the accomplishments of the Soviet Union and China, but also not to lightly dismiss the darker side of those histories. It's important to learn from both aspects.
Yeah, and it's like you'll still see plenty of articles in Jacobin saying that actually the Soviet Union or China did get some things right. They'll pick an example of like a Soviet film where like, oh, because everyone in the Soviet Union in theory had housing provided by the state, oh, like a woman can leave her abusive husband because she isn't dependent on him for housing. So things like that, or the fact that workers in the Yugoslavia had just as much access to get that beachfront resort because it was done by a public lottery, and that some factory worker could enjoy a vacation on the beach. And it's like, sure, it doesn't mean that Yugoslavia wasn't unpleasant to live in at times, or the Soviet Union or China, but they also did some things right, in addition to doing some things wrong.
Indeed. And much like liberalism, socialism, at least in Western democracies, has been transformed by the neoliberal revolution and the collapse of the Soviet Union. As we mentioned in the last episode, many of these parties moderated, downplayed their working class rhetoric, and adopted market reforms and privatization. Historical left parties are in general shadows of their former selves. These parties took a further hit in 2009 when many of these neoliberalized left parties were in government as the financial crisis hit, either due to the pervasive influence of neoliberal ideology or external pressure from creditors, bond markets, financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the European Central Bank or the European Union. Many of these governments imposed austerity on their own people, dealing a severe blow to their credibility. This also created an opening for the rise of far-right parties in countries like Hungary. However, mass protests against austerity following the Great Recession from 2009 through 2014 have also fueled the growth of left parties and the formation of new ones. In the U.S., Occupy Wall Street helped shift the Overton window, that's a term for the frame of acceptable political discourse, to the left and expose Americans to class struggle rhetoric. And the Bernie Sanders campaigns led to the explosive growth of the Democratic Socialists of America from about 5,000 members in 2013 to nearly 100,000 today. In Europe, anti-austerity protests led to the rise of Syriza in Greece in 2012, Podemos in Spain in 2014, and the growth of the Scottish independence movement in reaction to austerity imposed by the national UK government.
Which could still be a thing, remains to be seen. So now that we're up to the modern day, it's time to address the topic of our episode. So what do liberalism and socialism have in common, and what are their differences? We share some stated values, such as liberty, due process of law, belief in democracy, republic form of government, at least for us as democratic socialists, belief in human reason, secularism, etc., but we often disagree in how we interpret those values. Others we agree on principle, but there is difference in practice. And then there are those where there is an irreconcilable philosophical difference and a clear distinction between liberalism and socialism.
Now that you've heard a brief history of liberalism and socialism, you can imagine how the social and historical development of each ideology led to the adoption of different conceptions of liberty. Liberalism, originating as the ideology of merchants and the bourgeoisie, naturally adopted an emphasis on negative freedoms, that is, freedom from government interference, freedom from constraint. Socialism, as the ideology championed by working class movements, emphasizes positive freedoms, the right to a fair wage, a fair share of the products of one's labor, which is all of it, the right to basic human needs like food, housing, healthcare, education, and so on. As we saw from the section on the history of liberalism, there were and are many liberals who will argue that we need to pay attention to positive freedoms. And as we saw from the experience of 20th century socialism, ignoring negative freedoms, such as freedom from government interference, can lead to authoritarianism. Obviously, it would be problematic to focus exclusively on one or the other. This is why we're members of DSA and not of a small dogmatic leftist sect. To win, we have to base our strategies on current conditions, and we must preserve democracy within our movement if we want to build a more truly democratic society.
So, due process of law is another ideal that liberals and socialists both share in principle, but in practice, economic conditions often dictate the outcome. A rich person accused of a crime stands a far better chance of being acquitted or otherwise evading conviction, even if they're guilty, because they can afford a skilled and expensive attorney, while the poor person must rely on an overworked and often demoralized public defender. For the poor person, there is a pressure to plead guilty, even if only to a lesser charge, so that they will receive less prison time. The rich person can afford to pay bail, while the poor person might spend months in pretrial detention because they can't afford to buy their way out. It's hard to say right now what a truly socialist justice system might look like, or to imagine an alternative short of abolishing capitalism. We'll have to do an episode later on that.
Democracy. Both liberals and socialists say they believe in democracy, but they have very different interpretations of the word. In the liberal context, democracy refers to a very particular form of representative electoral democracy, and historically a very elite one where only men with property voted in the US, later expanded gradually and reluctantly to all white men, then all whites, then to Native Americans, and then African Americans. As we saw from that earlier quote from William Begehot, mass political participation was not part of the original idea. Socialists imagined democracy much more broadly. Corey and I both would agree that direct democracy is impractical for large groups of people and that some form of representation is necessary. But unlike liberals, we would argue that capitalism is fundamentally incompatible with democracy. Campaign finance reform as a concept has broad appeal, but it's not enough. Capitalists will never allow simple reforms to limit their influence over politics, the economy, and society. They'll simply find a way around them or water them down or get them struck down by a favorably inclined court if there isn't mass support to protect them. We also argue that democracy should not be limited to the electoral arena, that workers should have a direct voice in their workplaces by owning those workplaces. One idea that you may have heard is of the employee stock option program that would give employees a voice in how their companies are run, but this is something that is also favored by business owners because it gives workers an additional incentive to care about the competitive success of the company. This also does not guarantee that workers would win a controlling interest of the company, and it would not fundamentally restructure the overall economy.
Secularism. Liberals and socialists generally agree that government should be secular. Both are products of the Enlightenment, and the founders of both valued human reason over divine revelation. Most liberals historically have been religious, and most classical liberals would still believe that people should believe in something, even the deists. Open atheists were rare up until the 20th century. Socialism has often been assumed to be inherently atheistic, but explicitly anti-religious policies were more particular to more authoritarian states such as the Soviet Union, Maoist China, or the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Many socialists today are atheists, but there are also religious socialists. Marx and Engels happen to be avowed atheists, but historically many socialist movements were religious, such as the Owenites or the Diggers, and key figures in the American civil rights movement drew from both socialist theory and Christian ethics. And some of you might have heard a certain quote from Marx about religion being the opiate of the masses, but this has been taken out of context and would take too much time to explain here. We'll get into that in a later episode. Also, there are definitely some liberal states that have enacted anti-religious policies, such as Shah-era Iran, Kemalist Turkey, revolutionary France, and actually, to be honest, even France today, if you've heard about some of their laws trying to ban wearing the veils in public.
Lastly, while there is some overlap between some left liberals and socialists on certain policies like Medicare for All or a Green New Deal, for the most part, these are ideas that do not require total systemic change to implement. As many social democratic states in Europe has shown, you can have a wholly government-owned healthcare system funded by taxes, still within a capitalist market economic system. You can have a Green New Deal without entirely expropriating capitalists of all their wealth or property. Socialists generally like these programs, see them as a positive development for the life of the working class, but they are not in and of themselves socialist.
You'll see a lot of scorn from more doctrinaire leftists saying, "Oh, this is just social democracy. It's just social democracy." Well, we believe that you can radicalize people with social democracy, and that you give people a taste of something, it will make them want more, not less. These are radicalizing, not demobilizing. But that's an aside, and that's a whole nother, probably a whole nother episode.
That's also going to probably be another episode.
Here's where we start to get into the concepts where there is a clear and principled divergence between liberalism and socialism. There's a distinction between idealism versus materialism, like what drives historical change. At the root, liberalism and socialism are separated by the competing idealist and materialist philosophical conceptions of the world. So liberalism tends towards idealism, while socialism, since Marx and Engels, has been founded on materialism. This needs a small clarification. In common use, idealism means high-mindedness or having strong principles, while materialism means the idea that happiness can be achieved through worldly possession, buying, shopping. In philosophy, on the other hand, idealism denotes a belief that powerful ideas, enlightened individuals are the primary force in history, while materialism holds that matter precedes thought, that material reality conditions everything else, including social change and people's ideas. And Marx wrote that social existence primarily shapes consciousness, rather than the other way around.
This may seem abstract or pedantic, but it actually has major implications for how liberalism and socialism conceive of the world and how they practice politics in order to change it. Idealism often leads liberalism to confuse cause and effect and to reduce large systemic problems to individual ignorance or human nature. Materialism leads socialists to look at actual concrete economic relations and social structures for the root of problems. Incidentally, the word radical comes from the Latin for root. Marxism sees these relations and structures as the base from which the superstructure of ideologies and institutions grows. We'll discuss this topic more later as well, but how liberals and socialists look at problems like racism and the political far right are a good illustration of this difference. Liberals often see racist and reactionary views solely as a product of people's ignorance, paranoia, or misplaced hostility. Bad people acting out their bad ideas. But as materialists, socialists look further to see that ideologies which divide and stratify people are also a predictable feature of a society where a few exploit the great many, where to continue itself the system must make inequality seem natural and inevitable and must prevent the masses from seeing their common interests and uniting to change their condition. A good example of this is how in their book Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in America, Barbara and Karen Fields describe how racial ideology in the U.S. grew out of and served to legitimate an economy that had come to rely upon the super-exploited labor of enslaved people. Liberals will argue that to defeat the right, we must restore norms of civility and reasoned debate, whereas socialists will argue that the only way to beat bad politics is with more, better politics, a politics that speaks to people's real needs and shared aspirations, and organizes them to fight for their own emancipation and a better world for all.
Materialism also underpins Marxism's focus on class, and on the conflict between classes as a major driving force in history. To the degree that liberals acknowledge class as an issue, it seems mostly associated with income and education level, whereas for socialists, class has more to do with specific objective relationships with the economic structure.
Oh, I said objective.
Capitalists are those who own the means of production. The land, resources, productive assets. Think Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, those guys. And use that to obtain more wealth through rents and surplus value extracted from workers' labor. While the working class are the people who have to sell their labor to capitalists at a loss in order to survive. It's the only commodity that they have to sell. Exploitation is when you work, if I get paid $15 an hour, I'm probably generating $30 of economic output for my employer.
Or that's like 150.
Or 150. It really depends. That's the exploitation and were forced to do that in order to survive. And this mythical American middle class might be better described as the upper working class, higher paid wage earners whose positions owed to having specialized skills or the benefits of union organization.
Our point being that whether you have a high school diploma and make $15,000 a year, or if you have a master's degree and make $150,000 a year, if you still can't obtain basic necessities by selling your labor, you're...
Yeah. If being unemployed would be a problem for you, you're
probably part of the working class.
Yeah, you're working class.
So a relevant question here might be, why is liberalism idealist while socialism is materialist? And this, again, has to do with class. Liberalism, as we discussed, has its origin as the ideology of the bourgeoisie, a class which rebelled against the hereditary power and privilege of aristocracy, but which nonetheless itself sought economic and political dominance through the exploitation of other classes. This contrasts with the aim of socialism, for the proletariat to create a classless society. Every ruling class seeks to make its own particular interests appear as universal, and its own dominant position as natural and inevitable, rather than as historically contingent and subject to change. Thus, the bourgeoisie sought to explain capitalist relations as being in accordance with human nature or unalterable laws of history. Liberalism inherits this in such a way that even those who are not bourgeois themselves may unwittingly take its class perspectives for granted and view society in an idealist and unhistorical way. Socialism, on the other hand, as an ideology of the working class, reflects a historical interest in replacing capitalism, requiring a materialist lens with which to look objectively at how capitalism operates and how to oppose it. Materialism does not mean that Marxism or socialism deny the power of ideas or free will. Obviously, if they did, we wouldn't be here talking to you about them. Marx wrote that ideology can be a material force, but it is only so to the degree that it leads people to take effective, conscious action.
How can social and political change best be achieved? Another fundamental difference between liberalism and socialism is that with the former, the theory of change is top-down, set by experts and technocrats and great leaders, great men of history, while the latter is bottom-up and relies on popular mobilization. The differences in these approaches can be seen in the presidential campaigns of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Now, both had broadly similar social democratic platforms, but where Warren said, "I've got a plan for that," Bernie said, "Not me, us." Warren's campaign still exemplified the liberal approach to politics because it did not demand broad, sustained popular engagement the way that Sanders' campaign did. Now, while some socialists may derisively joke that liberals just want to vote for the smart person with the plan, go back to brunch, and honestly, we think there is some truth to that. In Mind and Politics, Ellen Meiksins-Wood writes about liberalism's concept of a freedom from politics, where there is an expectation of remaining unconcerned with public affairs most of the time. But with that said, it's not as if Sanders' approach entirely succeeded either, though it did help point a way forward. We still have a lot of work to do in elevating class consciousness in society and getting people to organize rather than voting for the lesser of two evils every 4 years. Ultimately, we think that a bottom-up theory of change is more sustainable in the long run because people will feel more invested in the change that they can participate in.
The personal is political. Many people, including a lot of liberals, will often act as though there is a sort of invisible separation between politics and the economy, that what happens in politics doesn't matter to the average person, but we argue that it does. You might have seen the meme about how you might not care about politics, but your boss and your landlord do. Liberalism sees undue government interference as tyranny, but does not view the exploitation of labor under capitalism in the same way. Most people don't want to live under a tyrannical government, but neither do most people want to live under a tyrannical boss. The fact that we have to work for a boss in order to earn money to pay for basic necessities, and the current weakness of organized labor, gives those bosses an enormous amount of power over us. They can restrict individual self-expression, ban workers from expressing political views while freely sharing their own, harass or abuse their employees, and if anyone complains, they can, in many states, terminate the employee with little or no recourse. Liberalism sees free markets and private property as preconditions for political and personal freedoms, whereas Marxism sees them as obstacles. The freedom of private property owners necessarily means the curtailment of freedom for everyone else. Socialists argue that when food, housing, healthcare, education, and other intrinsic needs are bought and sold on a market, there is naturally an incentive for those selling to charge as much as possible for them, which naturally results in some people not being able to afford them.
Is capitalism a neutral force? Liberalism seems to be split on this question. Right-wing liberals, including most modern conservatives, will argue that the invisible hand of the market is an impartial arbiter of value and push for so-called free markets. Left liberals will concede that, well, the market can be harmful if unrestrained. We can fix that with appropriate regulations to smooth off the rough edges. Liberals, especially those farther to the right, may claim that capitalism is based on freely made contracts between businesses, between employers and employees, and outwardly from a legal standpoint, this may be true. But Marxists hold that capitalist profit comes from the value created by labor, which workers do not receive, and that capitalism is thus inherently exploitative and unfair. And having a choice in employment is still not freedom if we must work to enrich someone else simply to survive and never receive most of the benefit that our labor produces. And for a brief overview of Marx's economics, I would read A People's Guide to Capitalism by Hadastier. Socialists will argue that there can be no accommodation with capitalism, that eventually the capitalists will attack any reform that begins to threaten their interests, and these can only be defended by mass organization of the working class making further inroads against capitalism.
On the subject of the choice does not equal freedom thing is all the debate about health insurance. Anti-Medicare for all liberals will be like, but Americans want choice in their healthcare. And it's like, yeah, I want a choice of who I pay a bunch of money to deny me healthcare when I need it, rather than like I would rather just pay some taxes and just get healthcare when I need it.
Yeah.
So nationalism, as we discussed in the section on the history of liberalism, its development coincided with the rise of nationalism in the 19th century, and that the revolutions of 1848 were primarily liberal in character. The revolutionaries during this period in Austria felt an affinity with their fellow Germans and dreamed of creating a greater Germany. Hungarian liberals wanted greater autonomy for Magyar people in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Italian liberals wanted to unify the Italian peninsula into a modern nation-state. At the same time, Marx and Engels and later socialists like Lenin strongly supported the right of colonized peoples and subjected nations to revolt against foreign rule and seek self-determination. At the same time, they were mindful of how national chauvinism could be used to divide workers against each other. Marx wrote about how British capitalists encouraged competition between English and Irish-born workers to keep the working class divided, for example, while Lenin and Debs opposed their government's war efforts in World War I, precisely because it would mean workers of different countries killing each other to secure resources and colonies for competing capitalists.
Interestingly, when we were recording, Isaac said Ironborn instead of Irishborn, so that was just like how, the Greyjoys from Game of Thrones are making an appearance into the history of socialism. Comrade Balon to the rescue. So what is the value of the marketplace of ideas? Should every opinion be allowed? Liberalism assumes that all political differences can be solved through calm, reasoned debate in the marketplace of ideas, that people with extreme political differences can coexist in the same society. And the desire for freedom from government interference that goes back to the foundation of liberalism makes liberals generally unwilling to use the power of government to maintain a liberal democratic order, at least within their own nation state, excluding, imperialism. The problem with that view is that when you're dealing with fascists, this relatively tolerant attitude allows the fascists, to spread their ideology, which, if successful, would destroy the very democracy that they incubated in. Socialists generally agree that there's a need for strong free speech protections, especially since leftists are far more often targeted for government suppression than the right. But it still drives us crazy, just how liberals don't seem to take the far right seriously. And as we saw from the rise of Donald Trump, people didn't see him as a threat. People laughed. And as we saw from his campaign and then later as president, norms offer weak protection against right-wing populists who just don't care. You can't shame Donald Trump into behaving like any other president. And we will argue that one thing that you can't tolerate is intolerance itself. To let a fascist make our point for us, the conservative philosopher and also Nazi, Carl Schmitt, made that very point about how fascists were able to incubate inside the liberal democracies in Germany and Italy and Spain and Portugal, countries where they took over, because they were able to use the free speech protections that they were given to spread their ideology. And then once they took over, then immediately abolish that same freedom of press that allowed them to gain their audience in the first place.
And one aside that I will make about that is that What we mean partly by liberalism not taking the far right seriously enough is also that they critically misunderstand what it is as a product of capitalist society, both the original fascist movements of the 20th century and more recent phenomena like Bolsonaro and Trump and Viktor Orban. Their foot soldiers are really reactionary members of the small business class, often funded by the big business class to help maintain the status quo by extra legal means when legal means will not suffice. And that having been said, like I don't think that censorship is going to be the answer, and it will, of course, always be used more against the left than the right. But again, the only way to defeat the far right is to actually understand what it is.
So way back at the beginning of time when we began this episode, we were talking about how we had neoliberalized left-wing parties, and also later on how you have far-right parties rising from material circumstances. If you look at the 40 years preceding the financial crisis of 2010, a lot of these neoliberalized parties in France and Hungary and Denmark, one of those things that happened is you had these social democratic parties that were able to maintain a sort of social contract. You had relatively socially conservative voters who would still vote for these working class labor parties because they offered material improvements in their circumstances. When these neoliberalized left-wing parties moved towards the center and they started embracing austerity and cutting social welfare programs, people lost that material incentive to keep voting for these parties. So when you have austerity from the left and austerity from the right and austerity in the center, then the relevant political cleavage becomes who's the enemy, who's the problem. And in the case of the far right, you had far right parties like Fidesz in Hungary offering some limited social welfare, but also whipping up anti-immigrant hatred. And you gave people something to care about. So other than material circumstances.
Right, and that's, again, why we as socialists want to focus on politics that actually addresses people's material conditions and universal shared aspirations for a better life that can help defeat and out-organize right-wing politics. So we've covered a lot of ground, and we want to just finish out with what the real implications are here. We know this was a very long episode, but our hope is that this gave the theoretical grounding to then go into more short segments on different topics addressing how liberalism and socialism tackle different challenges of our time. So our takeaway here really is that liberalism has plenty of values that are admirable on their face. However, as a bourgeois ideology, as the ideology of a particular class, liberalism has this fatal blind spot around the ways in which the capitalist economic system curtails those very freedoms and liberties which it claims to stand for. This has profound implications for how liberalism approaches the challenges of our time and leaves it ill-equipped to understand or address them. Marxism, however, provides us with some basic tools and methods to engage with the problems of today's world. It doesn't provide us with all the answers, but as I like to put it, it gives us the tools to start asking the right questions. But these differences in understanding in turn lead to vital differences in how liberals and socialists conceive of and practice politics.
As you've been listening to this episode, you may have heard some characterizations of liberalism that doesn't sound like how you understand liberalism. When we're talking about it in a very academic sense, but also maybe there's a reason for you to start to question why it is that you're a liberal. If what we're describing doesn't sound like the kind of politics that you believe in, then maybe you're not actually a liberal. Maybe you should be a socialist, or maybe even just a social democrat. Any progress that you're making towards the left, we'll take. We'll take it. But we did this podcast to educate people on what these two systems are and what distinguishes them, and that I think there are a lot of people who call themselves liberals who might not really be liberals, and there are a lot of socialists who call themselves socialists. But when you actually get into like the policies that they support, the kind of politics they believe in, might not actually be socialists. Maybe they're just social democrats or liberals. But we want to bring clarity to the debate. And with that said, we have come to the end of our time today, and so hand it over to Isaac, and we're going to wrap it up.
Right, so having covered this basic ground, the difference in the history of liberalism and socialism, and really that difference between idealism and materialism in terms of how they approach politics, what we're hoping to do next is to go into a series of smaller segments dealing with specific issues like the far right, like the climate crisis, comparing and contrasting the liberal and socialist approaches to these. And of course, what you are listening to is propaganda. We're going to make a case for why the socialist approach is better and what it is.
Among the topics we could cover, we have feminism, environmentalism, approaches towards policing, housing, labor and workplace organizing, foreign policy and internationalism, responding to the far right, which we've mentioned a few times in this episode, identity politics, interestingly, the term was invented by socialists, religion, socialist politics of historical figures, which is a personal favorite of mine. There's plenty of historical socialists that nobody ever tells you were socialists, like Martin Luther King, Albert Einstein, the greats, Helen Keller,
Frida Kahlo.
Yeah, Frida Kahlo. And then, of course, we're going to do a recap and a retrospective episode to kind of sum everything up and give a final pitch.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for listening. Looking forward to you joining us for the future segments. Solidarity forever.